afternoon, everybody. Happy Sunday to you, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Alana Marie Gopal, and I'm a member of the Bocas Lit Fest team. Welcome to episode 3 of season 5 of the Bios and Bookmarks series. It's our online author conversation series, and it's powered by the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. This season, we're taking a look at telling complex family stories. And for today's discussion, it is our absolute joy and honor to have the author of one of the most splendid debut novels joining us, Celeste Mohammed. Her work has appeared in the New England Review, Lit Mag, Epiphany, and The Rumpus, among others. And several of the stories in the novel that she's going to read from today for us, Pleasant View, have won awards, including the 2018 Penn Robert J. Dow's Short Story Prize for Emerging Writers, the 2019 Virginia Woolf Award for Short Fiction, and the 2017 John D. Gardner Memorial Prize for Fiction. She is a lawyer turned novelist, and she resides in Trinidad. And she's joined by a special guest host for today, Andre Bagoo, who is no stranger to the Bocas family. Andre Bagoo is a poet and writer from Trinidad, author of several books of poetry, including Trick Vessels, Burn, Pitch Lake, and his most recent essay collection, The Undiscovered Country, is this year's winner of the OCM Bocas Prize for Nonfiction. So the two of them are going to chat about Pleasant View, Celeste's debut novel. We know that the discussion is going to be insightful, wonderful as usual. We welcome all your comments and questions as we go live. And if you enjoy this conversation, which I'm sure you will, you can find more of our content on our special platform, the Friends of Bocas Lit Fest. We want to encourage you to join it, and we'll tell you more about it at the end of this episode. So sit back, do enjoy, and I hand it over to Andre now.
Hello, welcome to Bios and Bookmarks, powered by the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. I'm Andre Bagoo, your guest host today, stepping in for our regular host, Shivani Ramlochan. The previously announced guest host, Caroline McKenzie, was unable to be with us today. So we're broadcasting live from Trinidad and Tobago, the land of the hummingbird, steel pan, and calypso, and now, after last week, also the land of the swollen testicles. Thank you, Nicki Minaj. As Alana mentioned, today our guest is the wonderful writer Celeste Mohammed. Celeste, I'm so looking forward to this conversation because your novel and stories, Pleasant View, is to me one of the most acute and vivid encapsulations of Trinidad and Tobago life as we know it today, right now. And I really can't wait to talk to you more about it. But first, I understand that you've chosen a story to read with us and to share with our viewers.
Yes, hi, Andre. Hi, everyone. Hi, Bocas. It is a pleasure to be here, Andre. You are one of my most favorite people in the world. So it's great to have this opportunity to chat with you about the book. So yes, we don't have a lot of time, so I'm not gonna dilly-dally. I did choose a couple stories to read from today. The first one, my longer reading, is going to be from the story Ides of March. I just want to contextualize it a little bit before I read from it, because I don't usually read from this story, but I thought it might be nice to share a little extra insight with the Bocas folks today. Ides of March, as some of you may know, is a date. It's actually a date. It corresponds to the 15th of March. It's a historically famous date because that's the date on which Julius Caesar was stabbed to death by his friends in the Roman Senate, right? And it became an important date from a literary perspective as well, because Shakespeare took that whole incident and he made it into a play called Julius Caesar, which is one of my favorite plays. So I wanted to take that same larger-than-life drama And I forgot to mention, one of the major characters in the play, at least the beginning of the play, is a woman who is a soothsayer, or as we would say, a obia woman, or a seer woman, right? And she spends all her time trying to warn the nation, trying to warn Caesar, beware the Ides of March, beware the Ides of March. And on the very morning, as he's walking from his house to the Senate, he passes by her. And, he's Caesar, so, he's full of big man thing, full of hubris. He looks at her and he decides to throw some shade. And he says, the Ides of March have come. Like, I'm still here. You were wrong. And she looks at him and she says, I, Caesar, but not gone. And within minutes, he enters the Senate and he's stabbed to death, right? So that whole drama, to me, I just wanted to take it and put it into a Caribbean island setting with women, So we have the whole seer woman and we have the political man and we have all of that in this story called Ides of March, which I need glasses to read. The Ides of March. The doors of the Pleasant View police station had been locked since 11 p.m. Anyone needing assistance would have to shout from the gate. Corporal Sharp and his officers were snuggled away upstairs in the dormitory. Sharp lay with one arm behind his head, staring at the TV, twirling his mustache. He paid no attention to the movie, Legends of the Fall, or the officers' old talk. His mind was on the station diary's notes from the night before, the 15th of March. Pleasant View, Savannah. Political rally of the PNM. Police officers from Pleasant View Station as well as Northeastern Division Task Force. PNM candidate, Mr. H, mounted the platform. Gunshots. Mr. H unharmed. Escorted to his vehicle. Another loud explosion. Mr. H found bleeding. Wound to his abdomen. Female suspect and pistol seized and taken to another police station. Mr. H in critical condition. Inquiries continuing. The incident read like a highly organized multi-person attack. The first shots within the avenue being a diversion to get Mr. H to his car for the real shooter. A murder conspiracy. And the whole thing was big, big news too. Except the newspapers had gotten an important detail wrong. It was Northeastern Division Task Force, those big boys in Port of Spain, not the local Pleasant View police who had the suspect. This station's holding cell was empty. But still, Sharp lamented, if only he'd been on duty last night. If he had been on duty, some of that favorable press would have rubbed off on him. In fact, if he had been on duty, he would have used every trick in the book to make himself a big friggin' hero in the story. He needed that. He needed to change his image with the seniors up in police headquarters. The new holier-than-thou commissioner was on a crusade against bribe-taking officers. Allegedly, Sharp's name had been called. Allegedly, a transfer to some bushy station behind God's back was coming by way of punishment. No way. Sharp needed to stay right here in Pleasant View. His income depended on it. Commercial break. Sharp rose to pee and grab a snack. He shuffled his slippers across the black and white square tiles and pictured a drafts board. The game was his favorite rum shop recreation, and he felt its rules offered a tactical approach to life's problems. Rule 1, assess the board for weaknesses. In police work, for sure, weaknesses were everywhere. Some informer not questioned, some evidence overlooked, some move not made. Sharp just needed to find it. There had to be a way to huff this nice, fresh shooting incident, to pocket it for his own benefit. A noise came from outside. A metallic clanking. Somebody banging the padlock against the gate. The sound alternated with that female ghetto yodel Sharp often heard around Pleasantview. Oi, oi, oi! Oi, oi, oi! Officer! Officer! Thinking it was some drunkard whore wanting to sleep things off in the cell, Sharp yawned and scratched his balls, ordering, "Sentry, see what's going on there." A young police went to the metal louvers, always slanted, so the lounging officers could look down upon the world without being seen themselves. Copy, the young police said, breath snagging. It looking like a bear? A what? Every officer, including Sharp, rushed to the window. Was it an after effect of the movie? A trick of the mind? Sharp had to blink a few times. In the dark, hobbling along the fence line, there appeared to be a grizzly bear. Sputtering overhead light showed the thing covered, head to foot in dark fur. It bent over, grabbed something, then turned and hurled it toward the dormitory window. At the placks of stone hitting louver, everyone jumped back, and Sharp said, "Shit!" But in the same moment, he recognized it was not a bear, but a human. And he recognized the human as Miss Ivy, that old lady from Panko Lane who paraded around in a fur coat. Relief brought the baritone back to Sharp's voice. "Good night, Auntie. What's your problem this hour?" "Good night, son," Miss Ivy replied. "The officer in charge, please." "We closed, Auntie." "Yeah, but it's urgent. I have some hot information." "About what, Auntie?" Sharp was only asking for the amusement of his men. He knew from his wife that Miss Ivy was a babysitter by day and a seer woman by evening. Her area of specialty was cutting cards, using a deck of playing cards to foretell people's futures. She had quite a following, mostly women, and a kind of fearful reverence surrounded the old quink. Nobody in Pleasantview messed with Miss Ivy because they believed she knew things. Sharp didn't subscribe to that foolishness, though. He was sure she was here to waste police time with some Nancy story, some imagined tragedy. Then Miss Ivy said, "It's about the shooting last night, Mr. H. All eyes in the dormitory landed on Corporal Sharp. He frowned and pursed his lips, assessing the board for his next move. He knew, like everybody else in Pleasantview, that Miss Ivy had worked as housekeeper in Mr. H's house for ages. The fur coat was a hand-me-down from Mrs. H, given to Miss Ivy upon retirement. Miss Ivy sashayed through the streets of Pleasantview wearing it, Sharp believed, as a reminder to all that she was a woman with connections. It was possible. She might actually know something about this shooting, something he should know as well. "Okay, Tanti, I come in," he answered, and sent the young police downstairs to open the gate and the door. While he put on his uniform, Sharp once more weighed his position and the stakes. Transfer him to some Caneland outpost, an officer like him with 15 years' experience? He could not suffer that indignity. Worse yet, if he was transferred, he'd have none of the leverage he enjoyed in Pleasantview. He would be starting over and reduce the mere salary. How was he supposed to send his daughter to university on a policeman's salary? She'd been accepted to study medicine, starting this September. He had promised her that she could go. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for that, Celeste. That was amazing and a really good sample of what readers have in store for them. I mean, I think I would like to begin perhaps with asking you a little bit about this story, because it's a story in which you recall the same events, but from the multiple perspectives of different characters.
Yes.
And I noticed, well, this is certainly a thread that is woven throughout all of the stories in this book, which you call a novel in stories. So what I want to ask is, when you were putting this book together, did you always know that you were going to examine the events in this way from these multiple perspectives?
No. When I would say for most of the stories, I didn't have that in mind. I didn't even have it, as the stories came about. I kind of just went with it because 6 of the 9 stories in this book were kind of written during the time that I was doing my MFA. And I wasn't thinking about the end product at that point. I was simply thinking about getting my work handed in on time. It was when I sat to compile my thesis, then I kind of looked at them all together, and I saw there were linkages thematically and so. And I felt, well, here's an opportunity to show different perspectives, which is something I, as a writer, enjoy doing because I feel like, there's what is truth? What is truth? Your truth, my truth, So I had a bunch of stories, and I felt that there was a need in this case with this story to sort of have a watershed moment where all these people come together in one story and tell their perspective. So that was how this story was born for me.
And, one of the things that I noticed in going back to this book was it opens on a really audacious note. There's a really thrilling event that occurs at the very start.
Yes.
And it made me wonder, how did you decide in which sequence you were going to put all of these segments of this larger narrative in? Excellent
question. So again, at the time when I handed in my thesis, there was a different start, and it was only 6 stories, right? And then sometimes you can only really get to know a thing or understand a thing in retrospect. So having, done the thesis, graduated, and so I sat with the book as it then was, and I asked myself, am I finished with Present View? Like, do I feel like I'm finished? I have no more to say. Is there any way or any person that I feel like I want to give more airtime to? And so I started writing additional stories. And I had written 2 more. And then I read the entire book over again, and it still didn't start the way it started. And after I did that other reading, I kind of was like, I need a story that introduces people to Pleasant View and to Trinidad and situates them almost immediately in the power dynamics of the place. And I was like, okay, so which character should I put in that first story? And it occurred to me that the Venezuelan immigrant character, whose story is the least likely possibly to be told in a collection of this sort, if we view her as representative of something, her story, the story of South American immigration to the islands, precedes everybody else's story, because that is something that has been happening since prehistoric times, before any of us came here. So I felt, well, symbolically starting with the Venezuelan immigrant and that whole South American immigrant story is probably a good place to start the book.
And let me just say, the book is definitely finished. It is chock full of wonderful, it's brimming full of life. There is everything in this book. There's love, there's sex, there are people pursuing their dreams, there are people crossing boundaries nationally and personally. There's queerness, there's even politics in there. And you mentioned wanting to make sure that Trinidad was central in this, and I want to get a little bit more from you on that, because for me, another highlight of this book is how it so deftly manages to suggest not only the very specific town, the fictional town that you're writing about, but the country as a whole. And one of the ways in which you do that is through your language. And it's not just the dialogue, not just the use of Creole English in the characters. It's actually your omniscient narrator, or the moment, even the moments when the narrator subjectively enters a character's point of view, and you just have some absolutely wonderful literary devices and similes here. And I just want to read a few because
Sure.
you had you mentioned at one stage her shriveling face was a sapodilla spoiling in the sun.
Yes.
She walked around like a rusty clothespin. He was like a wabine fish. Your devices are inherently Trinidadian.
Yes.
And so I want to talk to me about that. Tell us, how important was it to you to get that balance right between, on the sentence level, getting Trinidad in there?
Mm-hmm. Again, an absolutely wonderful question. People have said to me that my prose, not just the dialogue, but the prose is kind of voicey. And I'm not surprised, because for me, I just feel like so much of what I do does not involve actually writing, but listening. Listening to the people around me, listening to the voices in my head, because there are voices living in my head. And I feel like that goes back to storytelling in the Caribbean, in Trinidad, is so much about listening and responding, and also, as a storyteller, catering for the air and using imagery that is indigenous, so that the listening audience can instantly picture and can hear. So things like onomatopoeia and rhythm, and just even like incantatory syntax, like syntax that puts you in a kind of spell. All of those things, I do try to employ them, because it's what gives us our voice. I once read a quote from Maya Angelou, of course, who is not a Caribbean person, but she did say, the point is to write it, and to write it in such a way that it goes down inside of them and they hear it as if, they're listening to the story. And that is always my intention. I want you to hear it as if you're listening to it, not reading words on a page. And it was important to me to use similes and metaphors, and so that would resonate immediately with a local audience, and would also teach an international audience something about who we are.
And let me just say, the writing is voicey, but that is such a strength, because there is a authority and an intimacy. And that's very rare, I think, to encounter in great literature.
That's so sweet of you. I have goosebumps.
I have goosebumps reading your book. And, your book is very much in that vein of classic literature, and many people have actually compared your writing to Chekhov. James Joyce has been mentioned in the same sentence as you. I'm just going to read one blurb from your book, on your book, by Claire Adam, the Trinidadian novelist. She says, in one of Chekhov's stories, a character says that every happy man should have someone who taps at his door with a little hammer, reminding him that there are unhappy people in the world. Reading Celeste Mohammed's novel and stories makes me think of that magical little tap, except that the door opens not to a vision of unhappiness, but to a world crammed with life that you never knew existed. Can you talk to us a little bit about your own literary journey, or your own journey to writing? Alana mentioned that you were initially a lawyer, and I think you gave that up in 2016.
Effectively, yes.
Tell us a little bit about that journey for you.
Okay, so on paper, the call to law preceded the call to letters, but in reality, it was the other way around. I've always wanted to be a writer. In fact, my first book was written at the tender age of 11 years old, and it was a mystery involving Johnny Depp and Def Leppard, the rock group. Yes. It sold one copy to my brother, but I've always wanted to be a writer. And I feel like I went into law under the misapprehension that it would be a more lucrative form of writing and reaching people. But after 10 years of practicing law, I realized that it was very unsatisfying for me because, of course, the writing that you do in legal pleadings and so is not the same. It doesn't leave a space for creativity. So after 10 years of practicing, I decided to really just jump in. I didn't have time to waste anymore. Just jump in and try my hand at it. I did the MFA program, and in the course of doing the MFA program, I realized that yes, this is what I want to do. So by the time I graduated in 2016, I was like, well, that's it. Can't go back to law. We have to go forward with Pleasant View.
Wow. I mean, I think it worked out. And
I think so.
I think, and you did put your legal training to good use, because in one of your stories, you do feature characters who are lawyers. And I think you're gonna read from that story for us today.
Yes, I will.
Well, why don't you do that now?
Sure, since you brought it up. Let me find that one. Right. This is from the story Home, which is set partially in Trinidad and partly in Barbados. And again, just to contextualize it, I am obsessed with this idea of islandhood and islandness and the island of the self, sometimes. So like this character, Kimberly, she thinks that she has escaped the island of Trinidad and is now able to live freely on the island of Barbados. But in fact, she has not escaped the island of her own self, her own tortured self, her own trauma. She carries that with her wherever she goes. And so, home. Kimberly spent the next day, Friday, in a pissy mood. And it didn't help that the managing partner kept needling her about a legal opinion for a Hong Kong client. He wanted it by day's end. Things got even worse when, around 3 o'clock, she said to her secretary, "No, you don't need another coffee break, Beatrice. I'm waiting on those pages," causing Beatrice to eye her from head to toe, wheel back the chair, grab her handbag, and sashay out of the office saying, "I don't need this Rasna," under her breath. By 5 o'clock, Kimberly had two-finger typed almost 7 pages and was exhausted. Flipping through the scribbles in her yellow legal pad, she estimated at least another 45 minutes of work on a Friday evening. If only she hadn't been so impatient and nitpicky with Beatrice all day. She dug her daily planner from the nest of papers and jotted a note for Monday. Take B to lunch, maybe buy flowers. Needing a break, she turned from the static glare of the screen to stare out the window at the Bridgetown sun. It always shone so fiercely at this hour, clung so desperately to the sky, fighting against its fate, its own nature, just before leaking like an injured egg yolk into the dark porcelain sea. Kimberly never noticed the sun in Trinidad, but now her eyes followed a length of light as it passed through the window, bringing a million specks, the fine print of the universe, to her attention. Rachel was wrong. Life was complicated. She returned to the computer screen, took a bite of the flying fish cutter that had been sitting on her desk since lunchtime, the bread now dry and choking. She ate slowly, skimming the last paragraph she'd written. International Business Corporation, Hong Kong resident, Barbadian courts, blah, blah, blah. Her brain felt clogged with other more personal arguments. She could not be a lesbian. A lesbian was a woman who habitually engaged in sex with other women. Kimberly didn't have sex with Rachel, and she didn't want to have sex with anybody at all. Not that she had anything against intercourse per se. In fact, had she not met Rachel, she would have done it by now with some man. The moment she graduated, Mr. H would have found a suitable match for her with some other Syrian duckling, even if he had to import one from Syria itself. Like her older sister, Kimberly had grown up knowing she would have to marry for profit, for dynasty, and she and her husband would have sex for those same reasons. But Rachel had changed all that. Their very first time together, Kimberly discovered a power that had freed her, but also frightened her. All the things she didn't know how to do, things she'd never done before, they soon came naturally as she embraced the delicious, illicit power of devouring another person. To tear them with your teeth and hands, to pry them open, to spread them wide, to reach until the tip of your tongue discovers their softest core. To take that too. To curl your lips over it and swallow the last of their dignity. To leave them with nothing but their plaintive cries. To own them. I will stop there.
Wow. One of my favorite stories in the collection, that line, Rachel was wrong, life was complicated. I think this story is a great example of the psychological acuity that you have. You're very much concerned in this book with moments of transformation or moments of crisis when a character is going on one trajectory and suddenly there's a challenge that occurs and they have to decide which end of the which one of the two paths to choose in the fork in the road. And this really reminds me a lot of something James Joyce once said about his famous short story cycle Dubliners, where he said in that sequence what he was aiming to do was not necessarily be too pinned down to plot, but he was aiming to bring characters to a kind of a climax where they come to understand something about themselves. And that is very often so much more harrowing than just an external incident, although there's a lot of incident in this book. But in that particular story, the relationship is really the anchor of what's going on. And maybe, I don't know if you could tell me a little bit about what you were aiming to do in all of these stories. Are you aligned with James Joyce? Is that what you were thinking of doing?
Yes, actually, Joyce's Dubliners is one of his strong influences on me and on this book. The first time I read it, I didn't understand what he was trying to do. But, with time, I came to appreciate exactly what he did in that, and has been done subsequently by other people, by Naipaul, by Sadie Smith with NW. Different people have done it. They've taken a place, a physical location, a town, whatever, a city, and brought it to life by showing you the intimate lives of the people who live there. And that is what I was aiming for with Pleasant View. I was not so concerned with making every story, have a perfect arc that ended in a nice, neat way. But I wanted to carry on a journey to a place and have you meet the inhabitants and have you feel like, wow, this is different, and each character within each story. For me, a story is most successful if the character changes. Not necessarily the situation is resolved, like the problem or whatever, but the character must change. He must learn something about himself, he must be challenged. His views should be challenged. And if he changes, I feel like I change the reader. You know what I mean? So I love to try to implicate the reader in this story. Have you rooting for one character, and then by the end of it, you're like, I changed my mind.
And you mentioned that's that strong sense of place, and wanting very much to uh, bring this Trinidadian space to life. But that story you just read, it was actually
Yes.
set in Barbados, and
Yes.
in some of the other stories, you deal with characters who come from Venezuela. In another story, it's about migration to America.
Yes.
And it is almost as though one sense of a very specific place is also determined in relationship to other places.
Yes, of course. Yes, that is again a really good point, Andre. You're so good at this. Poets are so good at this.
Oh God.
Yes. As with everything, you define yin by yang, darkness by light, and so it's the same thing. You always need a sort of coefficient or whatever you want to call it. And migration itself is a theme throughout the book. I'm always trying in one way or another to talk about migration, whether it's on a micro level of the couple moving out of Pleasant View and moving into the suburbs, or it's someone moving to another country, or somebody moving into Trinidad. We always feel as if the grass is greener elsewhere, forgetting that we take the poison with us inside of us to poison the grass wherever we go. Sometimes it really isn't about place as much as it is my characters coming to understand that the change they're looking for is not in a locale but within.
And many of the characters in this collection face very harrowing circumstances and come to very tragic ends. And yet the collection doesn't feel weighed down by pathos. It actually has a nice balance, I feel, in that regard. And is that something, how did you come to this voice, to this tone? How did you approach that?
Yeah. Well, I never set out to do evil things to my characters. It was just that, again, I read somewhere that, you start a story and you just follow the character. You give the main character something to want, and then you follow him. And that's what I tended to do. I would follow them to wherever the story. And I would be inspired by things that I see happening around me. You can't live in Trinidad right now and look at the news or read the newspapers or talk to people and not hear what is happening in this book happening in one way or another, right? The incidents. But I feel like with all of that, with all of the negative things that are happening in Trinidad, one thing about Trinidadians is our ability to find hope and humor in any situation. I mean, sometimes pathologically so.
Yeah, and some people think to our detriment.
Yes.
But I mean that, and you mentioned Naipaul, and I thought, well, maybe we could talk a little bit about that as well, because of course there's a through line between Joyce and Naipaul and Miguel Street and what you're doing here.
Yes.
And with him, of course, comedy is very much integral to what he was doing. We were recently at an event which was, I believe, commemorating the birth of Mr. Naipaul. Tell us a little bit about your own relationship with this Trinidadian writer.
I love Naipaul's works, and I'm not too put off by anything he might have done or not done as a human being. I love his literary works. I feel that he was a curator of Trinidadian life at a certain point in our history, and I admire that. I admire the authenticity of what he did, but he was the first literary person I held up as almost like an idol, but not really. But I so admired how I could read his work, and find it authentic. But I could give the same books to my friends who were not Trinidadians, who were American, or who were Panamanian, or who were from wherever. And they would read the books of Naipaul and come away feeling just as involved and engaged and amused. And I found that was incredible, that he could have struck such a balance And it is what I went into the MFA program hoping to learn how to do, only to find out that they can't teach you that. You have to, that they can't teach you that. That is something that I had to trial and error. I had to sort of figure out, how to adjust things to get just there.
So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit then about, who are some of the other writers that you were reading when you were putting these pieces together? You mentioned Sadie Smith.
Yeah. I've always liked Zadie Smith. I feel like she does what she does really well, which is to represent the place in which she grew up, and she's familiar with. I do like Juno Diaz. I always have. And again, I feel like he does what he does well. And he was like one of the pioneers of the whole using the short story and short story cycle thing. So I enjoy his work. I enjoyed his work. Who else? I have all of these people on my. I do like Chimamanda Adichie a lot. African writers, I find them very interesting, and also writers from the continent, from India, from the subcontinent. I find so much in their work, the work of African writers and Indian writers, that resonates with me.
So, there's something else I want to ask you about this book. So, I was recently at an event with the American writer Garth Greenwell, who had some very strong views on this question of the novel versus the short story.
Yes.
And we know that very often we get the sense that within publishing, there's this imperative to produce a novel. The novel is something that will be sellable. And short stories are often regarded as this kind of this niche kind of artistic thing. And even Naipaul, as we all know, began writing short stories, but only got published when he wrote novels. And Garth Greenwell was saying that he insisted that his book should be called a book of fictions, and not a novel or not a short story collection. And your book is described as a novel in stories.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about that designation for you. What does this form mean or represent to you, and what are some of the advantages, and why? What are some of the reasons behind this type of designation?
Yeah. Nobody has ever asked me that before, and I appreciate you asking me, because it's an important question. I detest labels of any sort. Maybe that has to do with being mixed race. But I do detest labels because I find them very constricting. And of course, I find that they sort of damper creative freedom. I started writing short stories just because that was what the program demanded that I do. I write short stories. But as it began to evolve in my mind, of course, my agent, everybody was like, you need to write a novel. You need to write a novel. But I feel that there is still so much you can do in a short story. It's like, you can do things and make things so much more punchy and impactful in a few pages rather than in a novel. And, yes, commercially, novels are traditionally more saleable because people read novels, people know about novels. But I almost wanted to deliberately change that. It is not, I admit it is not normal for the average reader in the Caribbean to go into a bookstore and say, hey, what's your latest book of short stories, literary short stories? But I wanted to sort of challenge that and to show that the short story format still is viable. It still is viable, especially today when people have shorter attention spans. And we're competing with social media and we're competing with all these things. A book of short stories can still be viable. And the linkages I felt in this book went beyond just linked short story collection. It was more than just linked. So I asked my publisher to call it a novel in stories, which they agreed to readily. They didn't give me any pushback. And as I continue to write post Pleasant View, I still feel the short story format is so freeing for me as a writer. I don't have to, I can just write whatever I find interesting. You know, I don't have to be confined by the form, the novel form, or this or that. I don't have to stick with one topic. I can write 6 short stories. And, you know, so to me, it is the perfect form for creation of new, fresh work.
Wow. And I mean, I'm just thinking of critics like Kenneth Ramchand, who I think very recently, he said that the short story is really at the heart of Caribbean writing in particular. And then he has actually identified elements of short story writing in major Caribbean novels coming from the 1950s. So maybe there is something that is inherent to the Caribbean space that resonates with the short story. But
there's so much happening, isn't there?
Yeah,
so much happening here. You know, it's you know that I would always encourage young writers, before you tackle a novel, why not try a short story, a couple short stories? You know?
Yeah, and I mean, and anybody who has something to say about short stories, just tell them about Chekhov, right?
Yeah.
And so now we're going to take some questions from our viewers. And
sure.
Bonita Lee Penn has a question for you, a great question for you. The question is, which character was a challenge to write or develop?
Yeah. Well, I would say the most difficult character was the one I just read, Kimberly. Kimberly was very difficult for me. It was very difficult to get the voice in that story right. A lot of reasons. Firstly, it was psychological on my part in that, remember, she is a lawyer. And I was very acutely aware of the fact that people tend to think when you write a first person story, the story started as a first person story. Me writing a first person lawyer story, people automatically assume I'm writing about myself. You know, so that was the first hurdle to overcome. And I did overcome it to some extent when I switched it over to third person. And then also, Kimberly is not a very forthcoming character in herself. She's a character who's hiding a lot and burying a lot. And the trick in that story was how to convey that without it being boring and flat. Because she's not saying that, you know, she's not saying much. So much of it is in subtext. So it was very difficult to write that character. And we won't even go there to mention the fact that in some sense I was writing about an other, someone who, you know, from the queer world. And I wanted to be so respectful of her experience that I didn't want to, I asked some of my friends who are queer to look at it and stuff before, because I just didn't want to be offensive or be creating a caricature.
But I think you succeeded, and her struggle is so real. I recognize that, you know, I know characters like this. And, you know, I just love what you said about the first person versus the third person, because that is such an interesting kind of dialectic that happens with, you know, you think the first person is very intimate, but even though you shifted to the third person, I still felt so intimately in her mind. It was really, really, really powerful. Camille Adams has a comment to share. She says, "Ooh, I love the contrast between the sensual descriptions of the relationship and the palpable detestation of the word. The language evinces the contrary emotional state as well," which, so I guess what you aim to do succeeded, you know?
I guess so.
You know, one of my favorite stories in this collection, and I cannot let this session end without asking you a little bit about it, is Santi Manite.
Yes.
Right? Because here's a story which contains stories, which contains extempo, and each extempo that is sung is a different version
Yes.
of the same story,
Yeah.
some of which are wrong and contradictory. And I just felt this was so fascinating, not to mention the devastating end of just the way the syntax of the end of that story it erupts on the page, and we kind of know what Miss Ivy's fate is there.
Yes.
I mean, it is extraordinary. I just want you to tell us a little bit about what you were aiming to achieve with Santi and how that story came together.
Well, if you notice, there are two sort of, as I said, watershed moments in the collection where multiple characters come together in a sort of communal setting. The first was the Ides of March, which I read from. And the next such moment is this one, Santa Manatee, which is also my favorite story. And I had the idea for it, the coming together of all these people at this event, which is a week. And I had in my head very clearly that I wanted this to be a confrontation of the battle of, this is the climax and the confrontation. The battle of the sexes is coming to a head. The battle of the classes coming to a head. Everything is coming to a head. And I felt it was right and proper that it should come to a head with calypso and extempo being the words and music being the weapons of choice. Only thing was, I didn't feel confident to be writing these verses myself. So I did reach out to someone, the incredible Myron Bruce, also known as Calypso Knight, who went viral a couple of years ago with his extempo news. It was all over Facebook, his extempo news, whatever. But anyway, at that time he was the reigning extempo monarch, and I reached out to him, and I was like, can you help me with this? And he was like, sure, what do you want me to say? And I told him what I wanted him to say. And he wrote the first verse. And then he said, okay, let's try working on the second verse together. And we did. And then he said, you don't need me, man. You could write the last one by yourself. So I did write the last one by myself. But yeah, that was the thinking. Everything should come to a head, and everybody should face off everything, in this one moment.
Listen, my paws raised. It was completely exhilarating, and I'm so impressed that you wrote that last one.
Yes.
I mean, it's also wonderful to hear you, acknowledge the collaborative nature of the story as well in that respect, But yes, thank you so much for sharing that insight. So we have reached the moment of today's episode where we normally, towards the end of these bio and bookmarks episodes, have a little game to play. And today's game is called Promptly Written. So a little background, Promptly Written envisions the following scenario. You've stepped, Celeste, onto an elevator with the publisher and editor of your dreams in conversation about some specific topic. It is now up to you to pitch them your dream project for that same topic, be it a book, play, sculpture, or musical album. This is your moment. What are you going to pitch?
Mako Central, right? I would say.
I love it.
I guess I would say, have you ever been to Trinidad? Have you? Do you know what a Mako is? Come with me. Let me show you. Trinidad and Tobago is the land of Makos. And this book that I am writing is about the quintessential Mako. She is a lawyer like myself. It's partly autobiographical. She's a lawyer like myself who, frustrated with the profession, leaves and seeks vigilante justice for her clients, her former clients, by catching their cheating spouses in the act and broadcasting it live on Facebook and IG and Twitter. I don't know, that's what I would probably say.
Wonderful. I mean, folks, you heard it here first. Trinidad.
That is my next book.
That's the next book. Don't forget the one with Johnny Depp, though.
Yes,
we must bring that one back.
Bring it back.
But you heard it here first, folks. Trinidad and Tobago, the land of hummingbirds, calypso, steel pan, swollen
And macos.
testicles, and macos. So, Celeste, I'd just like to thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us to talk to us about your exciting book.
Thank you.
I just want to say congratulations. The book came out in May, I believe, with Egg Publishing in the US. And further congratulations are in order because only this month, the hardcover UK edition has been published by Jacaranda Books. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and from all of us here at the NGC Bocas Lit Fest, I'd like to wish everyone who tuned in a wonderful week, and thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Andre.